Hi, everyone. So this week we are looking at APA style formatting part one, and we'll talk a little bit about what is APA style formatting and when and why is it used, some general rules for avoiding plagiarism, such as when to cite and when not to cite your sources, and just kind of looking at this introduction to APA style formatting. So APA stands for American Psychological Association, and this is a style or a method of formatting and referencing works in research papers and also in manuscripts. So I'm sure many of you have heard of things like MLA or maybe even Chicago style. There are a bunch of different other types of formatting rules that people can use. MLA is traditionally used in literature, arts, the humanities, English classes. You've probably written papers using MLA formatting. We tend to use AMA or American Medical Association style in medicine, health, and the biological sciences. And then Chicago style is used a lot in the media, such as books, magazines, newspapers, and other non-scholarly publications. So APA from the American Psychological Association is most commonly used by the social sciences. So nursing, psychology, political science, and economics. APA format is made up of the rules and guidelines that the writer must use to write a successful research paper, online discussion post, or even an assignment. So it includes all these different rules and guidelines to help you to write a paper successfully, embracing and using this style. And the goals of it really are to establish some standards of written communication regarding one, the organization of content, two, writing style, three, how to cite your references, and four, how to prepare a manuscript for publication. So APA style provides writers with a very consistent formula for acknowledging the works of others. It's going to adhere to some very uniform standards, and by doing that, it enhances your paper's organization and it allows readers to review your work with greater clarity. So by following that very kind of universal format within APA style, it allows your readers to focus more on the content rather than focusing on how it's organized. And building on that, it's providing a familiar structure that they can follow. So here are some reasons why people might want to use APA style, or might need to use it, I should say, since it tends to be required within the discipline of psychology. So it makes it easier for readers to understand a text by providing that familiar structure, and they know where to find things. If you open up a research article, there is a familiar format that it follows, which makes it expectable, right? And has that uniformity and consistency. Abiding by APA standards will, as a writer, allow you to provide readers with cues so they can use them to follow your ideas more efficiently and to locate information of interest to them. If they want to know the results of an experiment, they know where to go in the paper to get that. If they would like to know who your participants were in your experiment, they know where to find that information because it follows that very standard format. It also allows readers to focus more on your ideas by not distracting them with unfamiliar formatting. And it's important for establishing your credibility or your ethos in the field by demonstrating an awareness of your audience and their needs as fellow researchers. And where all this information is coming from, and we'll talk a lot about this later in the semester, is the APA, the American Psychological Association, did publish a handbook called the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association. And this dictates the format and style of the papers being published in the sciences. And currently, as of October of last year, or of 2019, the 7th edition is our current most up-to-date version. Now, there aren't a ton of changes from the last one, but they always change some little things, and so it's very important to be current as well when you're using the publication manual. And the most current one looks like this. This is an image of it, and you'll be reading some excerpts from it later in the semester. The other part of this unit for this week has to do with avoiding plagiarism. When should you use sources? And plagiarism is using someone else's ideas or a direct quote as your own without properly citing the source. Another word for this could be cheating, but the academic term would be plagiarism, presenting another person's work or ideas as your own. And here are some tips, some things that can help you to avoid plagiarism. Quite a few of them here. You always want to cite all of your sources using one style consistently throughout your paper. This makes it very transparent and easy to find. You want to cite sources using the correct information about the source where you found the information. You'll use both in-text citations and full citations on your references page at the end of your paper. Anytime that you quote something directly, you want to make sure to use quotation marks or the appropriate indentation in order to indicate that it is a quote. Paraphrase properly by putting ideas into your own words, and then make sure to cite any sources if you're using someone else's ideas. Avoid changing only a couple of words from the source or using the same sentence structure. Oftentimes people will make this mistake of like, oh, I changed a couple of words, so I don't need to cite it. But if you're using a very similar structure or all of those ideas, only minor changes have been made, you probably still need to cite the source. Make sure to present your ideas in your own words, supported by your research. Your paper should be mostly your own ideas and work with some support from other people. Your paper should be mostly your own thoughts, and then you use others to support what you are asserting and coming up with. You want to turn in a paper you created uniquely for the class assignment. Turning in a paper that you've already used for another class does constitute plagiarism. You're kind of copying yourself, if you will. So you might need to make some changes to it in order to make that allowable. You also want to keep thorough notes when you're doing your research, including all of the citations of the sources so that you have them later to put in your references page. A couple of kind of general guidelines of when to cite sources and when you don't have to. And these are kind of rules of thumb that might be helpful to you. Citing sources is often described as like a very straightforward practice, a rule-based straightforward practice, but in fact, there are an incredible number of gray areas, and you kind of just get better at this the more research that you do. Here are some kind of general guidelines that can help you to navigate citing and not citing and those different practices. Anytime you directly quote, you need to cite the sources. This is probably the most black and white, the easiest one to remember. If you quote someone, you have to cite it. Whenever you're summarizing or paraphrasing somebody else's ideas, you have to cite that source because those ideas are not your own. And you have to cite whenever you're discussing something that's highly debatable. Whenever it's debated or like very controversial, you're going to want to cite your sources. You don't need to cite when what you are saying are your own ideas. If it's your own insight, your own ideas, you don't need to cite that. That is yours, right? So if somebody else wants to talk about it, they will have to cite you, which is kind of a fun thought. You don't need to cite when you're stating common knowledge. If whatever it is you're talking about is in multiple sources, it's kind of considered general common knowledge, you're not going to need to cite that information. And a guideline that can be helpful in deciding whether or not to cite your facts is to determine whether or not the same data is repeated in multiple sources. If it's not, then it's best to cite. In general, I think it's better to cite something and you ended up not needing to than to not cite it and have it be viewed as plagiarism later. So I think it's better to oversight your sources rather than under-citing them. So that is really all we're kind of looking at for now. Again, just introducing what is APA style, who uses it, and then a little bit about avoiding plagiarism. Later in the semester, what we'll do is we'll get into APA style part 2, where we'll look at some general formatting, how papers are organized, the sections of papers, and so on. And then when we get to APA style part 3, we will look at how to do in-text and references, how to cite your sources in your paper and on your references page. So for now, make sure you get going on the materials for this week. Get them all done before the posted deadline. And I'll see you all next week for our next topic.